honored to be here today. I trained to an extent in France. I spent a year here in 1985 at Créteil in the reanimation unit with Dr. Lemaire and Brambuisson and Rapin. And they made a great impression on me, and I learned a lot, especially Maurice, who was extremely kind and was a really very important person in French intensive care medicine. And not only was he kind to me and our family, but I was there at a time when he realized that you had to speak English and you had to write manuscripts in English in order to influence the world, because the world wasn't about to learn French, although they should. They weren't about to. And he wrote a wonderful editorial in the Concours Médical, and it was hard for Maurice to speak English. And I love this. He appeals to the fact that when he has to speak English, he feels like a penguin on a basketball court. Now, we'll talk more about penguins in a little while, but I think Maurice was very important in that change. He was really a really gracious host. Here he is with Francois when I was with him in '85. And there's Maurice and his wife, my wife Nikki, myself, and my two children in the Loire. They had a place at Le Roc. They were really extremely nice, and he was extremely open to foreigners coming to France, spending time, and working with many people in the service, and he made a great time. The other fellow who invited me here today, I think, maybe you can see it, is this fellow here. And I frequently made expeditions to Antarctica, and in this one to Korea, to look at diving ladies. And here's Peter Rademacher. I thought you might like to see him as a young person in Korea. And here's Peter again, and he's drawing blood samples from a woman at about 15 meters depth in Pusan Harbor. Now, we were interested in breath hold diving, and we were interested in both human breath hold diving, and I don't have time to present that to you in 30 minutes today, and seals. Now, why was I interested in seals? I was interested in seals because one day when I was making rounds in the intensive care unit, somebody said to me, you know, there are seals in the world that can hold their breath for 90 minutes and dive to 600 meters depths. That's 60 atmospheres of pressure. I think I said bullshit, but nevertheless, we realized it was true. People had begun to build devices, little pressure squeezer devices, that told us that seals could hold their breath for long periods of time. In fact, this diagram, which is done much later in '97, shows you the Weddell seal here in the middle. And there's an average depth of dive, and you know that's about 250 meters to feed on fish. Peak depths of 600 meters, peak durations of about 90 minutes, and that was a record that we took on them. And an average depth, average time of dive of about 20 minutes, which is what it takes to swim down to 200 meters and catch a fish. Antarctica has the deepest diving seals in the world. There's some in the northern hemisphere as well. The northern elephant is known to dive deep. How do you get to Antarctica? Well, I was lucky enough to travel with the U.S. Air Force. You travel as cargo, as you can see. And this is a recent trip I took about a year and a half ago. And it's a long trip. It's about 3,000 miles south of New Zealand, where the major American Antarctic base is. This is the island that the base is on, and you have to kind of look at this for a minute, and you'll see there's ice that floats on top of the sea. It's 2 meters thick, and you can land an airplane on it, okay? So this is annual 2-meter thick ice, and the seals that I study, the Weddell seal, likes to swim all the way under this ice and have its babies way back in here. That way, it isn't eaten by anything. It doesn't want it or its babies eaten by anything. And you realize, of course, The entire Pacific Rim is volcanic, and this is an active volcano. This is Mount Erebus. So you land on the sea ice, which is quite flat, and the scientists come out. They're wearing red coats. You get into a truck, and you end up at the base. This is what the base looks like, McMurdo Station. It's been neatened up a bit. It's the Chicago of Antarctica. It's a large flying base with a population between 1,000 and 1,500 people, perhaps 100 scientists. And I've been coming there since the 1970s. I've made about a dozen trips for the National Science Foundation. But of course, for an intensivist or a biologist, the important areas of Antarctica are the rim, where life is. It's pretty lifeless in the interior. And this is the Transantarctic Mountains. This is a glacier coming down to the sea. And this is the sea coast. And of course, we have penguins. Do we ever? These are penguins named after Dumont d'Urville's wife, Adélie. And they're beautiful. They're the only penguins that have used rocks for nests. And scientists have been after them, as you can imagine, putting microcomputers and big computers on them and trying to study how they live. And of course, the predator in our area is orca, and orca feeds on seals and penguins, and thus our seals have learned to swim long distances under the ice, hold their breath for a long, long time to get away from orca, so orca doesn't feed on them. Now, you're French, and you know that Le Monde is found all over the world, even on the ice floes. And we posed this photo, but we thought it would be a great advertisement for Le Monde. This is Marguerite Bay, named by Jean Charcot, another French explorer who explored Antarctica in the Pourquoi Pas, a very famous set of expeditions before the First World War. So this is my seal, the Weddell seal. He's quite beautiful, or she, underwater. They're kind of smooth, they're speckled, so when a orca looks up at them, that he sees ice and not a seal, and when he looks down on them, he sees something that's black that looks like the bottom. This is Mount Erebus, contrailing away. It's a volcano. This is the glacier tongue, the glacier that comes off this 4,000 meter volcano. And seals are born in the same place every year, and all seals have their birthday in the first week or two of November. You need this synchrony if you're going to be born in a terrible climate or a terrible place, so you can gain fat and insulation and survive the terrible Antarctic winter, which will start in about March. So here you see combinations, mother pup. This is a pupping colony. The pups are born at about 40 pounds and grow to about 100 pounds, so 20 kilos grow to about 50 kilos in 30 days. The mother secretes milk that's 50% fat. Cow milk is 4% fat, just to give you an idea. So they turn their blubber into milk, and the baby grows an insulated coat. Our job is to catch a seal, sledge it far offshore, and drill a hole ourselves and use a helicopter and make sure there's no place that the seal can surface except at our hole. Then we have one seal, one hole, must return. And this is 1984, and about that time, you or your children or grandchildren had something called Apple IIs. They were just beginning to make computers, and so we built our own computers. And our computers had 56K of memory. 56K. Your watch has more memory than the computers that we built in 1984. We built them ourselves. And so this is catching a seal. You just use boards and get them to go into our sled, and then you sledge them 25 miles offshore to your hole, which you've drilled, and there you can solve the problems of how seals dive. Now, in a nutshell, I'll tell you how seals dive, and then I'll show you how we figured it out. Well, they deal with the cold, the minus 1.9 degrees Celsius of the Antarctic Ocean, by having blubber that's not perfused. So they might have 5 centimeters of blubber and not perfuse the outer shell. They have a problem with the high-pressure nervous syndrome, because if I squeezed you to 60 atmospheres quickly, you would seize. Your brain is sufficiently compressible that it would seize. We're not sure how, but we think partially by using nitrogen, an anesthetic gas, and partly by having the highest levels of plasma steroids of any mammal in the world, they control that high-pressure nervous syndrome and don't seize. Decompression, or nitrogen bubbles, they basically go through lung collapse. Total alveolar collapse on every dive below 30 meters. Maybe we should treat ARDS with total alveolar collapse. Seals know how to do it 50 times a day. And they also use blubber to dissolve and actually put nitrogen. If they take up a fair dose of plasma nitrogen, it's more soluble in fat nitrogen. Oxygen, the key to a long dive. You use the spleen, which is contractile. You have lots of hemoglobin in your red cells. You have twice our blood volume per kilogram and twice the red cell concentration that you have, and a ton of myoglobin. They have an extraordinary amount of myoglobin. That's just to give you some of the ideas of how they've differentiated to do this. And of course, you have the diving reflex, and birds and seals have it. What is the diving reflex? If you stimulate the face, the trigeminal nerve, you get apnea, you can't breathe, bradycardia, a slowing of your heart through the vagus, and peripheral sympathetic selective vasoconstriction of certain organs and not others, and I don't have time to tell you which ones. So here was the idea we came up with, following Jerry Koyman of San Diego. We had a seal. It had a microcomputer glued to its back. It had a fiber optic line and a cork. And when the seal came to the hole, we leaned down in the hole. We tied the seal's fiber optic line to the house computer. We dumped the seal computer data and reprogrammed the seal computer. Why? Because the seal has an arterial line and a roller pump that is triggered by the diving computer, so we can draw samples at 30 meters on the way down, 60 meters on the way down, 200 meters on the way down, 50 meters on the way back, so you can serially mark the dive. We plug the second hole, we let the seal in this hole. When he figures out there's a hole inside our house, we plug this hole, so he has to breathe in this hole. When we want to let him out, we unplug this hole, and out pops the seal. These are small male seals. They love to fish. They love to have a private hole over their own fishing ground, and they're delighted to be with us. You convince the U.S. Navy to drill a hole for you, usually with a couple of bottles of scotch. They drill a hole. We have a laboratory in the most beautiful place in the world. I'm slightly biased, but it really is. There's the volcano. We're out on the sea ice 25 miles. We're drilling a hole, and we put the southernmost extension of the Massachusetts General Hospital over the hole. This is diesel fuel Antarctic. This is the freezer. You don't need a freezer in Antarctica. Just throw it out the door. It'll freeze. And we live in one hut, and in one hut, the seal comes up in the middle of the floor. And I've always collected people from all over the world who were the best at what they were doing. And so Roger Hill built the computers. He was an Oxford engineer. There were obstetricians because we studied pregnant seals and we put EKGs and lines in fetal seals. Conrad Falke did nitrogen. Jesper Kvist from Copenhagen did oxygen. We did biochemistry from both Canada and Australia. So we had lots to do. Here's Roger. Here's what the seal looks like. We glued a rubber sheet to its fur. They lose their fur once a year. This is the computer. This is the power supply. This is a small radio transmitter. In case the seal gets away, we can find it with a helicopter. This is a flush bag for the IV, but it has to be hypertonic because it's minus 1.9 Celsius, and your IVs will freeze. This is the roller pump, which is triggered by the computer, an EKG line. This is the fiber optic line, and the cork that floats it. And in the next slide, hopefully.
When the seal was fully dressed, we had in principle two options.
This is a seal taking off after we put the computer on him.
Second emergency breathing hole located a short distance from the lab. We found that the latter,
there's the roller pump,
the seal for a short breezy walk in these brisk Antarctic winds, worked best.
That's colder outside than it is in the water.
There he goes. The seal shows on the road.
This seal shows on the road. It takes about 24 hours of work to get that far. It's a long experiment. They're apneustic breathers, right? So they hold at TLC. It's nicer than it is in Paris on a warm day in the summer in Antarctica, or in Boston, I would add. It's really a great place to work. So that's what it looks like, seal in the hole. This is a seal. He has a large single sample bag on. We had porcupines for multiple samples, and he's sitting in the hole. The ice is 6 feet deep. We've cut a perfectly circular hole, and he'll stay in the hole 3, 4, 5 days and make serial dives when he gets hungry. What did we learn? In the first dive, we knew the answer. We were told that there was no such thing as the diving reflex. It was a fear reflex. It was something that physiologists concocted in their laboratories. These seals aren't afraid. They're diving when they want to dive. Here's depth. Here's a little pop dive to 230 meters. Any of you ever been at 230 meters? I don't think so. I think 30 meters and you're kind of pushing it. But 230 meters pop dive. Look at the heart rate, 90 to 20. And then it falls to about 10 beats per minute. And then he grabs his fish, and I know because his plasma becomes turbid with lipid. All the fish are very lipidy there. And then he comes back to the surface. He lets his heart rate a little bit up to 30. And then not until he hits the surface and goes, does he release his bradycardia. And then he had a great big fish, so he slept in the hole for another hour. And this is a 28-minute dive, a long time to hold your breath. Jesper got the blood gases, and we had radiometer give us our blood gas machine. And this is basically the story of PO2 during diving. As the seal descends, the PO2 rises to 232. How could that be? The thorax is compressed, right? Instead of 150 alveolar PO2 or something, it'd be 300 at 10 meters. But that's rapidly burnt off during the dive. And as you can see, on almost any length of dive, from 5 minutes to 28 minutes, the PO2 is in the range of 30, and the lowest PO2 we measured was 18. 30 years later, somebody finally got a continuous electrode in and showed all our numbers were quite right. And so we're very happy with these numbers. Here's an 18. So 18 is probably the PO2 you would be on top of Mount Everest, 20, 18. So the seal goes to the top of Mount Everest on every dive. Hemoglobin rose. We were astounded, but as we took serial measurements, and here's 28 minutes of measurements, you can see by 10 minutes after the seal leaves the hole, its blood hemoglobin has gone from 15 to about 26 grams. How could your hemoglobin go from 15 to 26 grams? It wasn't clear to us. We thought a lot about it. We eventually focused that it was likely to be the spleen, which in a large 450 kilogram seal, which is what we were studying, would have 18 liters of packed cells in it. And as the seal went into either a single or a bout of diving, a bunch of dives at once, depending on what it's feeding on, the spleen would shrink down, pump in 16, 18 liters of packed cells. And all diving mammals have large floppy vena cava, so they don't get congestive heart failure from a big transfusion. And that's how their hemoglobin rises. And Bill Herford, an intensivist, now professor of anesthesia in Cincinnati, was kind enough to use an ultrasound and take pictures of the spleen size in the hole before and after the seal did the dive, and showed nicely that the spleen contracted. So not only did we guess it, we knew it. Perhaps the most important work we did was done by Conrad Falke. Conrad measured the nitrogen tension in the blood of seals. Now, if you're going to avoid the bends, you're going to avoid high nitrogen levels. And what the seal does, and of course our data absolutely support that, is as the seal dives, the alveoli collapse totally, and the gas is stored in armored bronchi, circular cartilaginous bronchi. So here's young Conrad with his Van Slyke apparatus, Van Slyking the nitrogens, and here's the partial pressure of nitrogen, not something most anesthetists or reanimateurs have ever thought about. Here's partial pressure of nitrogen rising from about 550 to about 2,000 at a depth of, if I drop down here, about 30 meters. It peaks. And then as you go beyond 30 meters, the nitrogen in arterial blood falls. But it's still high. And when the seal comes to the surface, it will also often be about 1,200 torr, 1,400 torr. So the seal, and probably the whale and every other diving mammal, is somewhat supersaturated, more saturated than it should be, and is therefore liable to bend if you're not careful. And the U.S. Navy has not been careful, and many seals have died off the Canary Islands, where large ultrasounds are used to look for Russian and Chinese submarines. Now you understand what happens. And of course, the great joy of working in the Antarctic is you're working on an unusual species, and people care about seals and penguins. And I would say half their information ends up published with ours in Science, a wonderful journal to publish in. And we even got the cover. So here's the group. I'll tell you a tale or two this is the somewhat different group. These are younger people. This is with Bill Herford when we did the spleens in the mid-90s. This is a fellow by the name of Greg Guyton. Some of you have taken and read Arthur Guyton's physiology book. This is Arthur Guyton's youngest son, Greg, who went to Harvard Medical School and worked with us. And this is my son. And I think all doctors hope their sons and daughters will follow them into medicine. And I was dreaming a lot about that. We had some visitors. Conrad snapped this photo of some visitors. These are emperor penguins. They're much taller. They're the largest penguin. You've made some nice movies. Get a chance to ski with my son in Antarctica, an unusual place to ski. I'm sure you'd like skiing down there. So here's David. Here, my son. Here's Greg Guyton and I, and we're anesthetizing a seal with a to and fro circuit. And I'm thinking, they're going to be two great anesthesiologists if I can only convince them to stay in the field and stay in intensive care. And of course, each time we get ready to do the seal, my son is disappearing, and I don't know where he is. And it's later and later and later, and we have to wait to start the study. And I say, "Where's David?" And no one will tell me where David is. And then finally somebody said, "He's out on a date." I said, "He's on a date? We're 25 miles offshore. There's nobody out there." And he said, no, he's found a young lady. She's working on fish over at that hut over on the corner there. And they've been dating. So he met Diana, his wife, out there. And this is David, and this is Diana. And this is their daughter, Ruth. And Ruth is named after this woman here. And her name is, she's Ruth Caroline, and that's Caroline, because the first woman to set foot on Antarctica. And Diana, of course, both our kids had worked and met in Antarctica, was Caroline Mikkelsen, who was the wife of a Norwegian sea captain. And this is a picture of her there. So the first woman got there. I would add, when I started in Antarctica, there were no women, and now it's 50%, as it should be. Well, one of the joys of working in Antarctica is when the U.S. Geological Naming Board decides they're going to give you a piece of Antarctica and name it after you. So this is the ZAPOL Glacier. This is Mount Vinson. Some of you may climb Mount Vinson. Mount Vinson is the highest mountain in Antarctica. And some very wealthy people like to climb the highest mountain on every continent. And I found out that there was such a glacier, the ZAPOL Glacier, because when I looked at an Australian climber's record, he said we crossed the ZAPOL Glacier the least bad option. And you can see there are a lot of crevasses here, so it might be a little dangerous to ski on it. So I'm going to end here, but I thought you should just see what seals look like, how they breathe. This is mothers teaching babies to dive. There's a baby seal, a little pup. They're no land predators, so they're very easy to work with. They just don't know what you are. Remember, they're going to exhale. They're going to reduce their lung volume as they dive. They're going to bubble off. This is on the helicopter. You'll pass our camp is here and there. Well, this is a perihelion. You see them rarely in Boston. This is the sun, and the sun is reflected. This is a double perihelion. We're looking towards South Pole. We're about 600 or 700 miles from South Pole here. Thank you very much for listening to me.